My father looked at me across the dinner table and said very quietly, "You will apologize to your sister before this family sits down for another meal together." And I looked right back at him and said, "Okay." That was the last word I spoke in that house. By the time the sun came up over the oak trees in the backyard, my car was packed, my room was empty, and I was already 3 states away. But what my father didn't know, what none of them knew, was that okay wasn't surrender, it was a detonator. And I had already pulled the pin. Let me back up. I grew up in Savannah, Georgia, in a house that looked perfect from the outside. Colonial revival, wraparound porch, the kind of home that gets photographed for Southern living and listed on historic home tours. My parents had built a small real estate development company together, starting in the late 90s, and by the time I was in middle school, Whitfield Property Group was one of the more respected mid-sized developers in coastal Georgia. Not a dynasty, not a Fortune 500 company, but comfortable. More than comfortable. There were two of us, me and my older sister. She's 4 years older, and from the time I was old enough to understand what favoritism looked like, I understood that it applied to us. She was the one who got the car at 16. She was the one who got the bigger bedroom and the college fund discussion at every holiday dinner. She was the one my mother introduced first at every party. I was the footnote, the and her younger sister too. I told myself it didn't matter. I studied harder. I got a full scholarship to the University of Georgia and didn't need their money for tuition. I chose finance, not because my parents pushed me, but because I genuinely loved it, the logic of it, the way numbers told the truth even when people didn't. I did 2 internships during undergrad, graduated with honors, and landed a position at a regional accounting firm in Atlanta the fall after I graduated. I was 23 years old and I had built something entirely my own. My sister, meanwhile, had come back to Savannah after a degree in hospitality management and married a man named, I'll just call him my brother-in-law, whose family had old coastal money and a portfolio of commercial properties along Highway 17. The wedding was the event of the season, or so my mother told everyone who would listen. I was the maid of honor. I wore the dress they picked. I gave the toast they approved in advance. I smiled in every photograph. 6 months after the wedding, my parents sat me down and told me they were restructuring the company. They wanted to bring my brother-in-law on as a managing partner. They wanted my sister to take over client relations, and they wanted to offer me a junior analyst role, reporting to my brother-in-law. I would be working under a man who had never taken a single accounting course in his life, in a company my own parents had built. I turned it down, politely, and went back to Atlanta. My mother cried. My father said I was being selfish. My sister sent me a text that said, "I hope you know how much this hurts, Mom and Dad." I didn't respond. That should have been the end of it. I had my own life. I had my own path. And for the next 2 years, that's how I lived. Keeping my distance, showing up some at Christmas, sending birthday cards, keeping the peace. Not because things were good between us, but because I was tired of fighting a war I hadn't started. Then my grandmother got sick. My grandmother on my father's side was 81 years old, sharp as anyone I've ever met and the original architect of everything my parents had built. She was the one who had lent my father the seed money for his first property acquisition in 1997. She was the one who had pushed him to formalize the business when it was still just 2 rental properties and a prayer. She was the one who called me every Sunday until the Sundays stopped because she couldn't always remember what day it was anymore. She was diagnosed with early-stage vascular dementia in the spring. By fall, she had moved into a memory care facility outside of Savannah. By the following spring, she was declining faster than anyone had prepared for. I started driving down from Atlanta on weekends. I sat with her. I read to her. Sometimes she knew who I was. Sometimes she called me by my mother's name. Either way, I was there. My sister came twice in 6 months, both times with cameras for social media. But none of that is what broke everything open. What broke everything open was a Tuesday afternoon in October when my grandmother, in one of her clearer moments, took my hand and said, "Baby, make sure you get what's yours when I go. Don't let them manage it for you." I didn't know what she meant. Not then. She passed away 11 days later. The will was read the following week. My grandmother had divided her estate 4 ways: my father, my mother, me, and my sister, each receiving 25%. Her estate was modest: the house she'd lived in for 40 years, a few investment accounts, some jewelry, and roughly $240,000 in savings. My share, before any liquidation, was somewhere in the range of $60,000. I never received a cent of it. What I received instead was a call from my father 3 weeks after the reading, telling me that the estate had liquidity issues and that the assets were being managed through the family trust for the time being. He said it was temporary. He said it was the cleanest way to handle probate. He said I would receive my distribution once things were settled. I was 26 years old and I believed him. Months passed. Every time I asked, there was a new reason. The house hadn't sold yet. The investment accounts required a transfer period. The trust administrator needed additional documentation. I was patient. I was reasonable. I was, as I would later understand, exactly what they were counting on me to be. It was 14 months after my grandmother's death that I finally requested a formal accounting of the trust from the attorney of record. His name was on every document I'd signed. I sent a certified letter. I sent a follow-up email. I called twice. On my third call, his paralegal told me, in a voice that was careful to say nothing directly, that the trust had been modified. I asked her to repeat that. She said the trust had been modified and that I should direct any further questions to the trustee. The trustee was my father. I hung up the phone, sat very still at my kitchen table for about 4 minutes, and then I opened my laptop. Here's something I learned in 2 years of working in forensic accounting, which is what I had moved into after my first job. Financial wrongdoing almost always leaves a paper trail. People who steal from family members are almost never sophisticated criminals. They're opportunists who count on the people they're stealing from being too trusting, too conflict-averse, or too emotionally depleted to look closely. They count on grief, they count on loyalty, they count on the particular exhaustion that comes from being the one in the family who always has to prove they deserve to be there. They counted wrong with me. I filed a formal records request with the probate court. Georgia law allows any beneficiary of a will to request an accounting of the estate from the executor. My father was both the executor and the trustee, which I would later learn from an estate litigation attorney I hired on contingency, was a significant conflict of interest that should have been flagged at the time of the will reading and wasn't. The documents I received 6 weeks later were 63 pages long. I took them home. I made a pot of coffee. I sat down at 9 o'clock on a Friday night and I read every single page. The house had sold 11 months earlier for $310,000. That sale had never been disclosed to me. The proceeds had been deposited into the family trust account, and then within 30 days transferred in 2 installments to Whitfield Property Group's primary operating account. My grandmother's investment accounts, 4 of them, totaling just over $180,000, had been liquidated in the months immediately following her death. The proceeds had been routed through a subsidiary LLC that I had never heard of, incorporated in Delaware 8 months before my grandmother passed away. I cross-referenced the LLC registration date against what I knew about my grandmother's diagnosis timeline. They had incorporated that shell company 4 months after her diagnosis. I put down my coffee cup. My hands were completely steady. That surprised me. I thought I would feel something volcanic. Rage, grief, betrayal all at once. Instead, I felt something colder and cleaner than any of that. I felt clear, I knew exactly what I was looking at, and I knew exactly what to do. I spent the next 3 weeks building a case, not venting to friends, not sending my father an angry email, not calling my sister to scream at her, none of those things. I pulled every public record I could access. LLC filings, property transfer records, Secretary of State databases, UCC filings, court records. I cross-referenced bank routing numbers from the trust documents against known accounts associated with Whitfield Property Group. I built a timeline, document by document, that showed the movement of my grandmother's money from the estate into the company. With my sister's husband as a named officer of the Delaware LLC. My brother-in-law's fingerprints were all over the structure. It had been his idea. I didn't know that for certain yet, but the filings were clear enough about who had signed what and when. I hired the estate litigation attorney. I hired a second attorney who specialized in financial fraud. I paid their retainers out of my own savings, money I had earned and kept separate from anything touching my family for exactly this kind of reason, though I hadn't known at the time that I would ever need it. My attorneys sent a litigation hold notice to my father, my mother, my sister, my brother-in-law, and the attorney of record for the estate. The notice informed them that I was pursuing legal action for breach of fiduciary duty, fraudulent transfer, and misappropriation of trust assets. It instructed them to preserve all relevant documents and communications. It was sent on a Thursday. That Sunday, my parents called a family dinner. I went. I drove the 4 hours from Atlanta to Savannah, parked in the driveway of the house I grew up in, and walked through the front door like nothing was different. My mother had made pot roast. My sister was there with her husband. My father was at the head of the table, looking like a man who was trying to remember how to look relaxed. We got through the salad course before my brother-in-law, who had apparently been elected to go first, said that there had been a misunderstanding about the estate accounting, and that everything could be resolved within the family if everyone was willing to be reasonable. I took a sip of water. My father said that the transfer of funds into the company had been temporary and had been done to protect the estate from a gap in the property market. He said my share would be made whole. He used the word restored. He said all of this looking at the table, not at me. My sister said she hoped I knew that they had always had my best interests at heart. Then my father looked at me and said it, the thing that cracked the evening open. He said, "We need you to withdraw the litigation hold. The notice scared our banking partners and we need this handled quietly. If you do that, we'll make everything right. But first, you're going to need to apologize to your sister for how you've treated his family." The table went very quiet. My mother was looking at her plate, my sister was watching me. My brother-in-law had picked up his fork and I said, "Okay." I picked up my napkin. I folded it and placed it next to my plate. I pushed my chair back from the table. I said, "Excuse me for a minute," and I walked to the bathroom down the hall. I stood at the sink and looked at myself in the mirror for about 30 seconds. Then I walked back out, picked up my purse from the chair, said thank you for dinner, and walked out the front door. I drove to a hotel 20 minutes away. I checked in. I sat on the edge of the bed and I called my lead attorney and left a voicemail telling her that the family had now made direct requests for me to withdraw the litigation hold at an in-person meeting, which I understood was potentially relevant to the record. Then I ordered room service and went to sleep. What happened over the next 4 months was not cinematic. It was paperwork and depositions and waiting and more paperwork. Litigation is grinding and unglamorous, and I will not pretend otherwise. There were days when I questioned whether it was worth it. There were nights when I cried, not because I missed them exactly, but because grief is complicated and losing your family, even a family that was hurting you, is still a kind of loss. But I kept going. The estate litigation attorney was extraordinary. She documented everything: the LLC formation timeline, the fund transfers, the failure to disclose the house sale to beneficiaries, the modification of the trust without court approval. My brother-in-law, it turned out, had been the one who first proposed the structure to my father over a year before my grandmother's death, when it was clear she was declining. The emails existed, they had not been deleted. People who commit financial crimes against family members almost never delete the emails because they never really believe the family will come after them. The case settled out of court 14 months after I filed. The terms are confidential, but I will tell you that I was made whole, completely, and then some. The attorney's fees were covered. The interest on what had been withheld was included. There were consequences for the estate attorney as well, through a separate bar complaint that my attorney filed on my behalf. Whitfield Property Group did not survive it. The asset freeze during the discovery process put pressure on lines of credit that had already been extended past what the company could comfortably service. My brother-in-law's family withdrew their involvement when the litigation became public record. My father spent 18 months trying to restructure, but the damage was too extensive. The company was dissolved quietly the following spring. The house, the colonial revival with the wraparound porch, was sold to cover debts. I did not feel triumphant about that part. I want to be honest about that. That house was where my grandmother used to sit on the porch in the afternoons and shell butter beans and tell me stories about what Savannah looked like when she was young. Losing it wasn't justice, it was just consequence. But my grandmother had told me to make sure I got what was mine, and I had. What I wasn't prepared for was what came after, not the legal resolution, but the phone calls. My mother called me in the spring, after the company dissolved, and she was crying and she asked me why I had done this to the family. I listened, I didn't argue. When she was finished, I said, "Mom, I didn't do this to the family. The family did this," and I responded. And then I said something I had been practicing for a long time, because I knew this conversation would come eventually. I said, "I love you, I don't hate you. But I'm not going to pretend that what happened was acceptable, and I'm not going to accept an apology that doesn't include honesty about what actually occurred. When you're ready for that conversation, I'll be here for it." She hung up. My sister has not called. My brother-in-law, through an intermediary, sent a message suggesting we could put this behind us. I did not respond. My father sent a handwritten letter in the summer. It was 3 pages long. He talked about the pressures he had been under. He talked about the property market. He talked about wanting to protect the family legacy. He did not once use the word wrong. He did not once use the word sorry. At the end of the letter, he asked if we could have lunch and start fresh. I keep that letter in a folder in my desk drawer, not because I read it, but because I want to remember, on the days when loneliness makes me generous with revisionist history, exactly who these people showed me they were. I am 28 years old now. I live in a one-bedroom apartment in Decatur, which I love. I have a job I'm good at and a few friends who know the real shape of this story. I have savings that I built by myself, and I have the settlement that closed the chapter on what my family took from me and from my grandmother. I think about her a lot. I think about that afternoon in the memory care facility when she held my hand and said, "Make sure you get what's yours. Don't let them manage it for you." I used to think she was talking about money. Now I think she might have been talking about something larger than that. About not letting the people who underestimated you manage your understanding of your own worth. My grandmother built the foundation of everything that family had. She lent the seed money, she pushed the first deal through, she sat on that porch and worked and saved and moved through the world with a dignity that I am still learning to claim for myself. And in the end, the family she built tried to erase the granddaughter who was most like her. They forgot something important though. She taught me how to read a balance sheet before I was 12 years old, and the daughter they threw away was the one who knew exactly where to look.